Hey, welcome back. In this unit, we're going to dive in a little bit deeper to each of the four major macromolecules. We're starting off today with carbohydrates. All right, a quick overview. A lot of this should be refresher from last unit. Life at the molecular level, so the very small level, is made up of large molecules called macromolecules. There are four types of macromolecules: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. And again, we're going to use this chapter to talk about each four of these in turn. Macromolecules are made up of these repeating units that we call monomers. So we see here we have monomer 1, monomer 2, monomer 3, and we're adding a fourth monomer. And that process, what we're looking at here, is called polymerization. We're making a polymer. For all four of our macromolecules, that's going to occur through what we call a dehydration synthesis. Why do we call it a dehydration synthesis? Well, as you can see here, the formation of macromolecules occurs when a hydroxide group, that's an OH, and a hydrogen are going to leave the respective ends of the macromolecule and they form an H2O. Hopefully we all recognize that as water. When they leave, the two monomers join. They're linked to make a longer polymer unit, and water comes out. So if water is coming out, dehydration. All right, so a little bit more about carbohydrates. The structure of carbohydrates, they're made up of a monomer unit called a monosaccharide. There are three main monosaccharides, or three monosaccharides we will talk about, which is glucose, fructose, and galactose. For all three of them, the chemical formula is C6H12O6. And really the only difference between the three is how those 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens are arranged. Each three of these have them arranged only slightly differently. Carbohydrates are kind of unique among the macromolecules we'll talk about because they do often exist as only a monomer unit. We're going to talk a lot about glucose this year, just glucose by itself. Most other macromolecules, if you have just one monomer, you really don't have the macromolecule, the whole thing. But for carbohydrates, you can have just one monomer and really classify it and call it the full macromolecule. Okay, as you start to build larger macromolecules, the next step up, another Greek word there, disaccharide. So di means two, saccharide means sugar. So when we start putting together multiple monosaccharides, we start by putting two of them together, we get a disaccharide. Some common examples of disaccharide, we see them here, they're discussed here: sucrose, maltose, and lactose. These are common. Again, sucrose you might use every single day. It's table sugar. If you have coffee or tea, we oftentimes put sucrose into our coffee. Maltose is also a very common disaccharide. We put malt into a lot of the starchy foods like cereals and pastas that we eat. And then lactose, I think we've all probably heard of lactose. It's a common carbohydrate found in dairy products like milk. If you've heard of people who are lactose intolerant, which is a big number of people, and that's absolutely fine, nothing wrong with being lactose intolerant, it means that after they're infants, they no longer have the ability to digest lactose, to break lactose in half. So here's an image of lactose. And if you're lactose intolerant, you don't have the ability to digest lactose and break this bond, creating a glucose and a galactose molecule. People who are lactose intolerant are actually considered normal. Those of us who are not lactose intolerant, we actually have a mutation. We're the mutants, and that we're able to digest lactose. Most mammals are not able to do that past their infant stages. So kind of a neat fact there. You can see the image here and kind of combine this with the image from the last page. The reason we have different types of disaccharides is just based on what type of monosaccharide makes them up. So if you have two glucose, you have maltose. If you have a glucose and a fructose, you have sucrose, and a glucose and a maltose gives you lactose. So that's why we have some different disaccharides. All right, continuing on with the structure of our carbohydrates. As you continue to grow and get larger and add lots of those monosaccharides together, you get a much larger molecule called a polysaccharide. And again, some common polysaccharides. Starch, you've probably heard of starch. It's in a lot of the plant materials that we eat, a common carbohydrate in human diets. So here is starch. They've got two examples for you here in the image. And again, notice all those hexagons linked together. So those are each monomer units. And again, the way that they're linked together allows for this different types of branching, and sometimes they spiral. And that's why we have different types of polysaccharides, all depending on how those hexagons are linked together. Another common polysaccharide is glycogen. See the image here with a lot of branches on it. Glycogen is something that animals make, and that's how we store a lot of our energy. And then the third type of common polysaccharide is cellulose. This is the most abundant polysaccharide on Earth. Cell walls. The primary component of cell walls is cellulose. So plants use a lot of cellulose, and you can see it's kind of got a very rigid structure here. They're very well lined up. Not a whole lot of branches, not a whole lot of randomness that you might see in starch or glycogen. Again, that makes it good for cell walls that all plants have. Okay, how do we form these disaccharides and eventually polysaccharides? This should look familiar. Common theme here. Here's our hydroxide ion. Here's another hydroxide ion. And what's going to happen is the H is going to leave. It's going to go off, and this OH is going to leave. And you're going to have water, H2O, two H's, and one O come off. The second O stays put and is what holds together the two monosaccharides. So that's our dehydration synthesis. Water is coming out. The second O stays put, and we call this a glycosidic linkage. So glyco sounds like glucose. Again, working with the Greek words, means sugar. So we have this glycosidic linkage, which holds these two monosaccharides together. Water releases, and voila, we're starting to build our polymer, polymerization. The reverse of this situation is pretty much the exact opposite. When you put water into this molecule, called a hydrolysis reaction, so breaking with water, that's the Greek term there, hydro for water, breaking lysis. You put water back into this, and you can break the two monosaccharides apart. And that's what's going on inside of our, when we eat food, when we eat starches and carbohydrates. That process starts in the saliva of our mouth. We're adding water to do hydrolysis, and we're breaking down those big, gigantic polysaccharides into more simple sugars. By the time they get to our stomach, we're really breaking them down into sugars, and eventually they leave our stomach and enter our bloodstream as single molecules, single monosaccharides, and our cells will take those monosaccharides, like glucose, and will break them down even further to get energy out of them. That process is called glycolysis. Again, there's that Greek word there, lysis meaning breaking, glyco sugar, so we're breaking sugar, and we'll cover this in more detail in Unit 6, exactly how we're breaking those sugars and getting the energy out of them. But for right now, again, we form polysaccharides through a dehydration synthesis, water leaves, and we break polysaccharides apart with a hydrolysis reaction. By adding water, we can get those monosaccharides back out. So carbohydrates have several functions, and really it depends on what type of cell the carbohydrate is in. For animals, we tend to consume carbohydrates we digest them, and then we use them for future energy sources. You saw a couple of slides ago, glycogen is a common polysaccharide that animals use to store energy. We also use carbohydrates on the surface of our cells as kind of a cell-to-cell communication. And I believe we'll get more into that in our next chapter, chapter 3. In plants, carbohydrates, the same thing. Plants use carbohydrates as nutrients, so they store energy for them. They break it down when they need that energy. But they also play a large role in the component of cell walls. We talked about cellulose. Cellulose, again, is a main component in the cell wall for a lot of different cells, plant cells. So it kind of depends what cell you're looking at as to what the function of the carbohydrate is. And another concept check, quite a few more terms we introduced today, so look these over. Make sure you're kind of familiar with them. Again, feel free to rewind the video, go back, pause, or even take a look at the PowerPoint if you're not familiar with any of these terms. And some questions that, again, having watched the video, hopefully you feel comfortable answering these types of questions. Again, if not, watch the video again, or look at the PowerPoint, or even come to office hours and ask a question if you have it. But here's what we covered today.